say is if they wanted to wait till he gets here, fine. If not, we'll go at her.
It looks like there will be oral questions put by members to ministers. I will now, the time is 12:46. We will finish at 1:46, and I will now recognize the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Mr. Speaker, this government has made another big deal with another big business. This deal will see mounds of Nova Scotia's private and confidential data being managed by an outside company, Mr. Speaker. The government's latest deal, Mr. Speaker, by the media report, was never presented to the privacy officer in the province of Nova Scotia. So my question to the minister, why is this government preparing to enter into a deal that could put personal and private information at risk without consulting the privacy officer?
Honourable, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just for clarity and for transparency that it was reported to the Privacy Commission. Mr. Speaker, this is a very significant week for the province of Nova Scotia, as that this government has been able to create an additional 1,000 jobs for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what the minister forgot to say was they consulted the privacy officer after they signed the deal, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are told this deal will create jobs in Nova Scotia. We've heard this before from this government, Mr. Speaker. The government decided to hand over management of Nova Scotia's private and personal information without talking to the privacy officer before agreeing and signing this deal. We've seen this government's big deals go sideways in the past, and Nova Scotians have seen wages slashed and Nova Scotians laid off. So my question to the minister, with so much at stake, why does the government feel Nova Scotians are better off with their personal information under the management of a private company?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is a process, there's a privacy process which this government has adhered to. And again, Mr. Speaker, for 20 years, this province has been in last place. For 20 years, we are not satisfied with the status quo, Mr. Speaker. Under our watch, the status quo is simply just not good enough. We created jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and we are continuing to do just that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what's interesting, this untendered contract was rushed into without any debate, without any consultation with the privacy officer, and, Mr. Speaker, without any discussion in this House. On November 16, 2006, the Premier, the then opposition leader, said, and I quote, "Mr. Speaker, this is a plan to centralize and then outsource important government functions without any discussion on the plan. These kinds of discussions should be discussed publicly. The people who will pay the price are being kept in the dark." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, so my question to the minister, if in 2006 the now Premier believes such deals should be openly debated and discussed, did he tell the minister what has changed?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we came into power, undoubtedly things were in quite a disarray and quite a mess. We've committed under the Jobs Here plan to create jobs, to create opportunities for Nova Scotians so that our youth could stay here in the province of Nova Scotia, raise families here, do work here. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we're concerned about, and I hear one of the members over there grumbling, and one of the things that we did not want to do and we will not do, much like the Liberal government is intent on, that's raise power rates by 30 to 50%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a job creation This is job creation. And I know it may be difficult for the Leader of the Opposition and for his colleagues to understand that, but the status quo, simply put, was not good enough. 500 new jobs for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. 500.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, families across this province are struggling to get by. With an aging population, more and more people are having to stay home to care for an elderly loved one. The expensive policies of the NDP have made life so unaffordable for seniors. Budgets are stretched so thin. Too many seniors are being forced back into the workforce. This government has made life so expensive that those who should be enjoying their golden years are going back to work to make ends meet. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister of Community Services. After working hard and contributing for years, does the Minister think seniors deserve to be forced back to work in order to make ends meet?
The Minister of Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, I find it quite amusing that comes from that side of the House, with the lack of concern over the years that they directed towards seniors. We do know that seniors are a critical part of this province, and we desperately and care about them, and that's why we're taking action. For example, Mr. Speaker, the GIS. Now those individuals receiving that do not have to pay provincial income tax. They could have done that. They didn't do anything like that. We have provided seniors with the affordable tax credit, also the poverty tax credit. We also increased the rebate on the land by $200. We took the HST off of electricity. There's a long list, Mr. Speaker. Their list equals zero.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And since the Minister is providing statistics and facts, I'll provide a few to her as well. Mr. Speaker, since the NDP formed government, the number of men over 65 who have had to get part-time work has more than doubled, an increase of 112.5%. Also, Mr. Speaker, aside from those seniors who have managed to find work, the number of seniors in the province who are looking for work and cannot find it has increased by 200% since this NDP government formed government. What does this show? Well, not only have the NDP made life so expensive that seniors are back to work, Mr. Speaker, but they don't even have enough jobs to support all the seniors who need it. So my question to the Minister, will she take these shocking statistics seriously and finally tell her colleagues that their expensive policies are hurting our most vulnerable people?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the member opposite take a look in the mirror, and the reflection would be from his federal counterparts that have done so much to create issues for seniors, driving them into poverty, not even allowing them to be able to access unemployment. So what about the seniors in Cape Breton and throughout this province that are in dire straits, not because of this government that has actually invested well over $300 million, an unprecedented amount, to help the most vulnerable? It is the person that he should be talking to is the Prime Minister of Canada, not us.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has been very good to stand in her place and blame others for the tragedies that occur to the residents of this province. Mr. Speaker, these people have worked hard their whole lives and are being forced back to work because they can't afford their bills. Many of these seniors are not only working, but they're the working poor. The latest Hunger Count survey showed 1,650 seniors in our province had to rely on a food bank last year. These people, Mr. Speaker, paid taxes their whole lives. Now this government has forced them back to work and forced many of them to food banks. Our seniors deserve so much better, Mr. Speaker. So my final question to the minister, will this minister sit down with the Premier and figure out a way to give these people the retirement they've earned and deserve?
Hear, hear. Honourable Minister of Seniors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I find it very interesting in the fact that he keeps reflecting back to the hunger count information, and I don't think he read through it, because one of the things in there that was a recommendation to help seniors was with respect to the GIS. And it was this government who made the decision that seniors who are collecting GIS do not have to pay taxes anymore. So that is a recommendation that this government has done even before that recommendation came out. So I don't know what he's standing there and talking about. He should obviously read a little bit more about all the things that we're doing in this province.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government announced an untendered deal with IBM today. We've seen the government write big checks to Irving, Daewoo, Resolute and Stern. Big deals with big business. Now this government hands money to the 9th largest corporation in the world, Mr. Speaker. So far, $590 million to 6 large companies. This makes $690 million to 7. And so far, 1,300 Nova Scotia layoffs. My question for the Minister of Economic Development. How many Nova Scotians should expect layoffs because of this government's latest big deal with big business?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, all Nova Scotians should be happy that this government was able to broker a partnership with one of the top 10 countries in the world, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, do you know what that means? Do you know what that means to Nova Scotians, to taxpayers? It means, Mr. Speaker, that we are going to have more money. We are going to have more money because of jobs, because of the revenue that's going to be generated from those jobs. We are going to have more revenue that we can invest in health, education, all those good things for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a good deal for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if this deal was tendered, maybe the government would have learned a little bit about IBM's past. In 2005, Carlson, an international hospitality giant, decided to enter into a multi-million-dollar agreement with IBM. Carlson terminated the deal early and sued IBM for $75.8 million. The suit alleges fraud, breach of contract, and breach of fiduciary responsibility, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister, is this government confident entering into business with a company facing these allegations?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with this partnership, IBM is talking about creating a global center. A global center. Where? In Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, do you know what that means to the province of Nova Scotia? I am shocked. I am appalled that anybody in this House would speak against such an investment by such a major corporation. This is enormous. This is an enormous benefit for Nova Scotians. This is going to keep young Nova Scotians here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Court documents in the Carlson case state, quote, instead of bringing trust, expertise, and capabilities to Carlson, IBM delivered the opposite, end quote. The company says IBM failed to provide 30% of the contracted services and was not, quote, minimally competent, end quote, and I'll table that article. A Deloitte audit found accounting mishaps after the IBM deal that included restaurants threatened with closure for missed payments, information mistakenly being sent to competitors, IRS fines, and $1.8 million check mistakenly sent to a local lawn service. My question for the minister: why has this government entered into an agreement with a company that, according to one of its major customers, cannot be trusted, lacks expertise, and is not even quote-unquote minimally competent?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this partnership includes universities, Nova Scotia Community College. This is a true partnership, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am surprised. No, do you know what, I'm not. I'm not surprised, because they are job killers.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, with every passing day, we hear of more tragedies and allegations of the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. This is a story that bridges decades. Mr. Speaker, governments of all political parties have had responsibility in this matter. This is not a political issue, Mr. Speaker. It is a moral issue. So my question for the Premier: will the Premier call for a full public inquiry on the allegations raised by former residents of the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the question that is asked by the Leader of the Opposition, of course, very serious one, and as described, we have all seen some of the stories that has been described. I would also want to point out that over the years, the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children has also been the home to many people who have received assistance and help. The staff who have worked there have been concerned with the welfare and best interests of the people in their charge. There is no doubt that this is difficult, but there are investigations currently underway by the appropriate authorities looking into allegations of criminality. There are in the courts the claims that are being made by individuals who are looking for compensation. It is in the best interest of everyone that those claims, those allegations be properly investigated, and to see whether or not the information that is required comes out through those channels. After that, we would consider what the options are for further inquiry.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, calling for a public inquiry on these allegations is not about laying blame, Mr. Speaker. It's about finding the truth. An inquiry can take place. Well, this case is before the courts. We can be the generation, Mr. Speaker, that shows compassion to these Nova Scotians who've been waiting for it. There's only one person, though, who can call for a public inquiry, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Premier: will the Premier do the right thing for the former residents of Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children and call for a public inquiry?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I can say is that I suppose there are different views of what the right thing to do. I think the right thing to do is to have the proper authorities of the province, the policing investigators, to go through the jobs that they have, to look into the allegations that are being made. I think the right thing to do is to ensure that the claimants who are making claims for compensation on their own behalf and who are pursuing their appropriate legal remedies have the ability to do that to their fullest extent. And I'll address another point on this too. It is not that a public inquiry couldn't be called. I'm sure it could. The question, of course, is should it? And my view is that in these circumstances, where there are ongoing criminal allegations and criminal investigations, and there are outstanding claims before the courts, that those should be properly dealt with before further action is taken.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has given us all kinds of reasons why government can't go ahead with a public inquiry. Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, he's not given us a single good reason yet. Mr. Speaker, none of the reasons put forward by the Premier trump the fact that these Nova Scotians deserve justice, Mr. Speaker, and they need this justice to heal.
My question for the Premier is again, will the Premier call for a full public inquiry?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, my previous answer, in fact, was all about justice. It is about having a process that weighs the facts, weighs the evidence, has proper investigatory mechanisms, ensures that both the complainants and any accused are treated fairly and with due process, that claims can be weighed before an impartial arbiter. I mean, those are the very hallmarks of the system of justice that we live in, and I believe that we ought to allow that to run its course, and then we can decide whether or not it is appropriate that further inquiry is needed.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to return to the issue of today, the IBM deal, and ask a question of the Premier. Mr. Speaker, often in opposition we're called upon to oppose the government and what it does. And there are those, of course, who believe that's all there is to the job of opposition. But sometimes, Mr. Speaker, our job rises above that, and it is to make sure that the government, when it goes about initiative, does it in the right way and not the wrong way. And so today, Mr. Speaker, I ask a question of the Premier with our qualified support for the announcement around IBM today, if it truly creates real, new private sector jobs in Nova Scotia as they go about outsourcing some of those government jobs. The reason that we have to examine the deal, Mr. Speaker, that was announced today is because the government has a pretty poor record when it comes to these kinds of things. For example, just last week, they tried to lease some office space in Cornwallis without bothering with the public protection, the taxpayer protection of an open tender to make sure they got the best deal. And so my question for the Premier today with regard to the IBM announcement is, as much as IBM may be the right partner for the province in this outsourcing deal, why did the Premier not put the process through a proper tender to ensure that taxpayers really are getting the best value for their money?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in short, the answer is simply this. There is no other partner available who could provide the impact in the province of Nova Scotia. This is about 500 new jobs with a company that is a global leader in information technology, Mr. Speaker. And for the employees of the province of Nova Scotia, they are now in the enviable position, in the best of all possible worlds. They are able to decide whether or not they want to stay with the province of Nova Scotia, with a government that values their work, or they can choose to have a career with a global leader in information technology that can take them far beyond what the public service could offer.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just want to make sure the Premier has done his homework here. Perhaps he's not aware of companies like Unisys and Oracle and Cisco Systems, all of whom are competitors of SAP, and so I would like him to go back and ensure that he has, in fact, found exactly the right partner on this outsourcing arrangement. Mr. Speaker, $12 million in tax rebates is a lot of money. And as we learned just yesterday, the NDP are prepared to throw that money around even when it's only moving jobs from one part of Nova Scotia or one company in Nova Scotia to another company in Nova Scotia. So I would like to ask the Premier if he can assure all members of this House and also assure all Nova Scotians that none of that $12 million in rebates will be used simply to pay IBM for moving one existing Nova Scotia job, whether it's with the government of Nova Scotia or some other Nova Scotia company, to IBM.
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the 500 new jobs are in addition to any jobs associated with the work that they will be doing for the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, this is an extraordinary opportunity for the province because the money generated, the $18 million that will be generated in tax revenue, which these jobs will provide directly, means that essentially IBM is paid with their own money. They receive back money that they pay out. So the net benefit to the province is $6 million that will go into health care, will go into post-secondary education, will go into making better roads in the province. Mr. Speaker, this is a winning situation for the province, and it's a winning situation for the economy of the province.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope, as you see, I'm trying to be helpful here, but I sure wish the Premier's answer had been, yes, I can assure this House that none of that money will go for existing Nova Scotia jobs, and if that's what he meant, then he'll have an opportunity in a minute to just make that clear. Mr. Speaker, at a time like this, when the government is outsourcing jobs, the Premier has a duty to make sure that his own employees and the government of Nova Scotia are treated fairly. Now, reports of this initiative have been in circulation since early this summer, and in fact, just 2 weeks ago, the Premier said outside this House that this is just an idea, it's just a concept. But here we are today, just 2 weeks later, and the deal is done. So clearly the Premier and his government were in deep negotiations with IBM all along. So my question for the Premier is, why wasn't he more upfront with his own employees about what was going on with IBM?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm actually quite glad that the Leader of the Conservative Party asked that question, because the fact of the matter is that from the time when there was any serious consideration of this deal, in fact, the employees were, through their representatives, included in those discussions. They were brought in very, very early on, and in fact, were at every step involved. And this is part of the Public Service Protection Plan that we signed on. I was surprised to see reports that they were coming in yesterday only to hear about it, for months. They had been part of the whole discussion, and we offered them every bit of information and every bit of support, because we see this, as I've said, as an extraordinary opportunity for our employees. They are the ones who will gain the maximum benefit from this arrangement. They have an opportunity where they can decide to go to work for a global leader in information technology, that they can carve out their own career path for success, or if they decide, they can stay as a member of the public service who we value.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Economic Development. Aecon Atlantic operates a shipyard in Pictou, just kilometres down the road from the government-subsidized, partially taxpayer-owned DSME Trenton facility. Aecon actually repairs ships and builds barges, direct activities in the Nova Scotia shipbuilding industry. My question to the Minister, how many vessels has Aecon Pictou Shipyard repaired in the last 2 years, and what government assistance have they received?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, nowhere is it predetermined as a prerequisite that private sector notify me as Minister of Economic and Rural Development on what their employment, on what they produced or what they haven't produced.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister's decisions directly interfere with competition in that sector, so I think it is an important thing that he pay attention to what's happening in that sector. Let me help him out. The Pictou Shipyard has repaired 16 vessels and built 2 barges. It has a workforce of 150 people. The reason why I ask, Mr. Speaker, is because it'd be nice that the Minister has this information. I'm sure the Minister of Health has all the answers, so maybe he can answer this, because we don't get any answers from the Economic Development Minister. Yeah, you don't know. Yeah, you know what's going on. Yeah, you've got it figured out. And the Premier wants me to ask him. I assume that the Economic Development Minister is equipped to answer these questions, Mr. Speaker. I have to ask the Premier questions about economic development? Really?
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The workforce at Aecon is 150 employees compared to less than 50 at the SME Trenton. In fact, it has done all of that work without 1 cent of provincial money, not 1 cent, but is now facing competition from the government-subsidized DSME facility, even though the Premier and the Minister can't seem to figure out that they are interfering with direct competition. So my question to the Minister or the Premier, whoever wants to answer it, what assistance was requested by the Pictou shipyard in the last few years, and what was the response from ERDT?
Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, DSTN is a value client of this government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like so many other companies, DSTN, parent company, is a global company, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they have diversified. We got the utmost confidence in DSTN, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they have a plan. We have a plan. We are sticking to it, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that.
Honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure the Minister does have confidence. After all, they have 60 million taxpayers 60 million tax dollars as an advantage in their sector. So no wonder they're confident, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 2 years, Aecon Pictou Shipyard has invested $6 million of their own money from their own revenues in repairing the marine slip in Pictou and has brought back the shipyard to life. This investment has resulted in new work being created in Pictou County to the tune of 150 jobs, Mr. Speaker. The Pictou shipyard has not received a cent from this government. Meanwhile, this government has invested in Irving facilities in Halifax and Shelburne. So my question to the Minister, what is his justification for rejecting assistance from a tax-paying, job-creating entity in Pictou County while instructing government-subsidized DSME Trenton to diversify into the same market as Aecon?
Honourable the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I haven't been to the Pictou yard recently. I understand that the Premier's been there a couple times in the last little while. I will say this, Mr. Speaker, is that we've made good investments, Mr. Speaker. Under the jobs here strategy, Mr. Speaker, we've made good investments that are paying off, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there was an announcement today with respect to IBM, Mr. Speaker, a great announcement. There was an announcement yesterday, Mr. Speaker, with respect to project for a total of 1,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker. This has been a glorious week for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. A fantastic week for Nova Scotians. We are making things happen in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, something that the previous two governments didn't do with 20 years of inactivity.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Fisheries. As members know, most lobster fishermen are small business people who each create jobs in small numbers and are struggling to get by because of high taxes, high fuel costs, and a depressed market for their product. A couple of years ago, the government, Departments of Fisheries and the Department of Labour, gave approval to the WCB to move forward on setting up the Fisheries Safety Association of Nova Scotia. So to add to their financial burden, small fishing operators pay the same dues to the the Nova Scotia Fisheries Safety Association as large seafood processing plants do. So my question to the Minister of Fisheries, will the Minister act immediately to ensure lobster fishermen are treated fairly by the Fisheries Safety Association of Nova Scotia, who do now pay more than their fair share to the government-sanctioned Safety Association?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Well, thank you very much, and to the member Hobbs, I really appreciate the question regarding safety. And I think all members of this legislature wants to know that fisheries is one of the most dangerous jobs there is in Nova Scotia, and something that we have addressed. I also want to point out that the issue that the member raised has been something close to the industry and something that this government has addressed, and this minister. I want to table a letter that we put out to the fishing industry, and I'll just read the highlights from that. And there's consultation going on, and there will be continuing consultation, and there'll be a ministers' meeting, fisheries ministers' meeting, mid-winter. And in the consultation, the number of issues were addressed was first of all, was the process and use, the establishment of Fishing Safety Association, also the amount of the levy charged to large and small employers, and workman compensation rates in the fishing industry and the fish processing sectors, and most effective ways to improve safety in the fishing industry. This is something important, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the question. Thank you very much. Can I get a copy of this?
The honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minister for his answer. The contract between the WCB and the Fisheries Safety Association of Nova Scotia clearly states that the WCB must have over 50% support from the industry in order to proceed. And the reality is that the WCB did not get sufficient approval to set up the Fisheries Association in the first place. Fishers have paid close to $700,000 per year to the Safety Association, and a number of fishers have actually resigned from the association but are still being charged the fee. I have over 97 letters of resignation from fishers to the Fisheries Safety Association. I'd like to table that and maybe get a copy for the minister. My question to the minister is why the minister is forcing this expensive association on a small group of businessmen who never agreed to participate in the first place.
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much. And to the member opposite, I want to be crystal clear on this particular topic. This particular issue has been driven by the fishing industry. It's something that we addressed early on in this mandate and something that we are committed to. We want to reassure that the safety of all fishers are something important to this government. I look forward for the consultation to be completed. I also look forward to the Ministers' Conference this particular winter. And unlike the member opposite, when he was the Minister of Fisheries, they had an opportunity to deal with this. We are taking a proactive approach, and we are making the workplace safer for all fishers across Nova Scotia. Thank you for the question.
The Honourable Minister, the Honourable Member for Argyll.
Mr. Speaker, the situation is such that government actually went out to get a consultant to look at the issue. Consultant by the name of Gilles Thériault. The Thériault report looks into the issues surrounding the Fisheries Safety Association of Nova Scotia. Like so many consultants' reports before it, the government did not release it. We can only assume, like that so many other consultants' reports before it, that the minister didn't like it, so he buried it somewhere. Through a Freedom of Information request, I was able to get a copy, but like so many of our FOIPOP requests, it's been heavily redacted. In this case, recommendations from the consultant are hidden. It does underline some concerns that the organization was set up without proper approvals or acceptance by the industry itself. So my question to the minister, what is the minister hiding from? What is he hiding from fishers who are more affected by the Fisheries Safety Association of Nova Scotia? When will he release an unredacted copy of the report and shine the light of day on how dollars of hard-working fishers are being used by government?
Honourable the Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, I really appreciate this question coming to the floor, because this is something that we are going to address. And unlike the former member from Argyll that did not address it when he was a Minister of Fisheries, Mr. Speaker, this is something that's important to the industry. It's industry-driven. I made reference to the issues that we're addressing with the consultation. I look forward to the Ministers' Conference this winter. Unlike the member opposite, we stood up. This government, this Premier, this Minister stood up for the owner-operator policy, which that government tried to enforce on the independent fishers across Nova Scotia. And I want to say we're going to make it stronger. Thank you for the question.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP government's corporate welfare plan is hurting small businesses around the province, so my question is for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, who incidentally probably should change his department name to the Minister of Part-Time Jobs, but I guess that's another question. Mr. Speaker, this minister handed Pacific West over $124 million to lay off half their workers, drive down wood prices, and hurt small woodlot owners and operators. We learned learned some time ago that independent woodlot owners and sawmill operations will now get less money from Pacific West for wood fibre than they did under the previous new page. This reduces the economic activity in the province and drives down wood prices, and it makes it harder for people to even cover their costs, let alone their bills. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why he agreed to a deal that only helps big business and makes life much harder for small, independent woodlot owners and operators?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unlike the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, this government did not turn its back on the forestry sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we save hundreds of jobs with our investment, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of jobs, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, if anyone was to look at the paper and listen to the news media, you will hear that those people are grateful. The first thing that they say is thanks to a premier that was there for us. Thanks to a government that was there for us. Unlike the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, we were there.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to say everybody's grateful, I'm wondering whether the minister has his talking points messed up, because the member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour appeared at a chamber dinner there recently speaking on behalf of the Premier, and he blamed local business owners and municipal politicians for being against the deal. So I guess the NDP just blame everyone for their own failures in their communities. And in fact, check the tape. In fact, I think the NDP must think it's the fault of the people on the South Shore that Resolute packed up and left too. You know, Mr. Speaker, the deal has no guaranteed job targets. It doesn't guarantee continued operation. It hopes for it. Mr. Speaker, we said early on in the Bowater situation the government should work to diversify the economy, and they did so only after Resolute packed up and left. We've said the same thing here. Mr. Speaker, the Minister and the Premier are happy to call the layoff of hundreds of people, cuts in income and benefits for the rest, and an attack on small woodlot owners and operators a success. Mr. Speaker, why did the Minister not ensure there were guarantees in place for small woodlots so they wouldn't be forced to pay the price of a poorly handled deal?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the Liberals, we didn't turn our back on 1,400 families, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unlike those job killers over there, Mr. Speaker, unlike those job killers over there, Mr. Speaker, we did something for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We did something for that industry, for the people that live there, for that town, and for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, so that they can contribute to Nova Scotia society.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, the only job killers are the people that handed out $590 million to lay off 1,300 people in Nova Scotia. You know, and Mr. Speaker, now this minister has waged war on small businesses and the small woodlot owners who now can't even afford to put fuel in their chainsaws or put food on their tables. You want job killers? It's that minister right there. You know, Mr. Speaker, these woodlot owners have been told if they don't take the price, then they'll be the next ones the NDP members will be speaking on behalf of to say that it's their fault that the mill closed because they wouldn't accept the price that Stern was willing to pay, even though that price doesn't even cover their costs. Mr. Speaker, we have now learned that Stern is trying to arrange a deal with Irving to trade fibre and wants to do this by taking complete control over the marketing of forestry products in Cape Breton and northern Nova Scotia. This goes actually against diversifying the forest economy into higher value products. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister agree to call Ron Stern today, tell him to stop picking on the woodlot owners, give them a fair price that allows them to meet make ends meet and stop thwarting efforts to diversify the forest industry in this province, and especially in Cape Breton, Northern Nova Scotia and Port Hawkesbury.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to punt this over to the Premier.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, the ironic thing about this question is if the Liberals had their way, none of those contractors would be working because the mill would be closed. There would be nobody working in the wood in the forest divisions, Mr. Speaker. They would be working probably in the forests of Alberta or in British Columbia. They wouldn't be in Nova Scotia. That is what the Liberals would have, Mr. Speaker. And I want to make this further point. This morning on CBC, there was an interview with Mr. McMillan from the Civiculture Contractors, and what he said was that woodlot owners that he realized that this was a difficult time for woodlot owners, but he phoned into New Brunswick and asked what they were getting for their cords of wood, that they were getting anywhere from $5 to $15 less a cord in New Brunswick than they were getting in Nova Scotia. When the host tried to push him and said, we realize this is a difficult time, but is there a bright spot in the industry? He said, the bright spot in the industry is the government.
We're all set again? The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Minister of Justice about using ankle bracelets to monitor certain patients at the East Coast Forensic Hospital while on unescorted leave. The Minister made irrational and unfounded comments about this party's beliefs. We believe that protecting the public and the patients is paramount. These patients need proper care, which they cannot receive if they do not return to the hospital. Will the Minister explain why he refuses to use ankle bracelets as a practical and effective tool to prevent someone else from getting hurt by someone with a past history of violent behaviour?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I know it's difficult for the member asking the question to understand that a forensic patient is just that, a patient. That mental illness is a disease, not a crime. As Minister of Justice, it is my job to ensure that the rights of every citizen are protected and respected, that public safety is foremost of this government, of this minister, and to the people of Nova Scotia. Therefore, whether or not someone needs additional care or security is best put for those that have the medical responsibility in that area. In addition, if the member did some reading and understood that in many cases, putting such an instrument on a person with a mental illness further perpetuates the treatment, the ability to provide treatment. So this government cares about people and respects people.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
And Mr. Speaker, I think the family of Raymond Tavel has a hard time understanding why somebody who has a disease can be left unmonitored on the streets to commit a crime, to hurt somebody. So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Tavel's family is asking the minister to explore using ankle bracelets in certain cases. The minister is discounting their concerns by evading this question. The minister's answer is to give patients on leave a cell phone. We cannot risk another incident because a patient fails to answer the phone, loses the phone, or doesn't provide an accurate itinerary. This government consistently keeps our most vulnerable waiting, whether it's with waiting lists for surgeries, waiting lists for nursing homes, and now this government has created a waiting list for public safety. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell the people of this province why?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the deepest respect and compassion for the Tavel family and the struggle and journey that they must have to endure with the loss of a loved one. The 18 recommendations that come out of the study, this government, this minister, is following and is in the process of implementing that constructive input by experts in the field. It's critical that we have processes in place that people with mental illness are reoriented back into society in a very respectful and humane manner. The very tone and approach sometimes by the third party seems to imply that anyone that makes a mistake in society should be locked up in a jail.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's just not true. And we feel just as much for the man who committed the crime in this case as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to let the family speak. With respect to the recommendations in the report that the minister has referenced, they say, and I quote, "The simplistic rejection of GPS tracking for surveillance of not criminally responsible offenders results in the joint review falling far short of this necessary and reasonable protection for the public." And I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, this is about making sure no other family, the victims or the patients, has to endure such a tragedy. This is about keeping these patients safe and ensuring they remain in their treatment programs, and is about protecting the very people we represent. Mr. Speaker, will the minister finally agree to open his mind and consider taking the necessary steps to protect all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the Tavel's family's concern for safety of all citizens. I believe unequivocally that we need processes and steps in place to protect our citizens and to ensure the protection of those that are incarcerated or those that are in forensic units. Therefore, it has always been my position to allow experts to provide in-depth, constructive information that's well-researched and founded. And in the study that we had done, the review that we had done was 18 recommendations we were following. Let's implement those processes. Our mind is fully open, and we will look at other ways should there be a need. However, we must be cognizant that we act in a very strategic, practical manner and in the best way of all citizens. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 7 years ago, this legislature passed Bill 158. The now Minister of Health and Wellness stated during debate of the bill in 2005, and I quote, "It's been a long time coming for this type of legislation to finally recognize a profession that is extremely important in the healthcare system in Nova Scotia. While the Minister cannot defend the previous Conservative government who did nothing on this bill, could the Minister of Health and Wellness tell us why, after 3 years in power, this NDP government has also failed to proclaim the Paramedics Act?"
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for this important question. No question, I have discussions on a regular basis with my former colleagues within the paramedicine field here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's why we recognize the importance to continue to consult with them to ensure that we bring forward the recommendations and the legislation that was passed in 2007. I've stood in this House from day one acknowledging my support for the need of this piece of legislation. I've worked on this way before entering these halls, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure the member that I'll be doing my due diligence as the Minister of Health over the last 5 months to move this issue forward.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since the passage of the Paramedics Act in 2005, we have paramedics administering clot-busting medications to heart patients, and this is a good thing. We have paramedics expanding their scope of practice beyond a traditional ambulance setting in nursing homes and emergency departments and collaborative emergency centres, and this is a good thing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, however, like every other healthcare profession in this province, paramedics deserve not only to be recognized but supported with a regulatory body that implements and maintains practice standards, and as well, the public needs to be supported with a process that ensures patients' concerns can be heard. Being a paramedic himself, why hasn't the minister seen the paramedics bill proclaimed? Just proclaimed.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No question the reason I'm in the legislature today is because how paramedics were treated badly in the past, Mr. Speaker. I want to ensure that all paramedics in Nova Scotia ensures that their best interest is at heart, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the former minister for all the work she has done in healthcare to expand the utilization of paramedics. The key in Nova Scotia and in healthcare, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that we utilize our healthcare providers to the best scope of their practice, Mr. Speaker. And paramedics, I'm glad to say, have been instrumental in changing the model of care here in Nova Scotia. And I said to the member opposite in my first answer, he can rest assured, as a former paramedic, that I'll continue to work extremely hard to move this file forward, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here we are, seven and a half years later, and we're still waiting to proclaim a bill that all parties agreed was a good piece of legislation. The Conservatives said in 2005 would take up to 6 months to proclaim. Mr. Speaker, we need to respect the profession of paramedicine. We need to recognize and celebrate the fact that paramedics are doing more and more in our healthcare system. And finally, Mr. Speaker, when will the Minister of Health and Wellness see fit to proclaim the Paramedics Act?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. No question, in the last 5.5 months as the new Minister of Health, I'm very proud to be a paramedic and be in the position I am in today, Mr. Speaker. I know there's been delays for many years. The member can just turn behind him and ask the former Minister of Health why there was delays. He could turn to the member over here who was a former Minister of Health why. So, as the Minister of Health, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Health and as a proud paramedic, I will take care of the paramedics of this province, something the both of you never did, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to his credit, the former Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, the Honourable Member for Timberlea Prospect, announced a 5-year highway improvement plan during his time as Minister. Mr. Speaker, one of the major elements of that plan for the residents of Richmond County and throughout Cape Breton was the reconstruction of Route 4 from the Cape Breton County line to the community of St. Peter's. Mr. Speaker, last year I stood in my place, last fall in fact, to raise concerns over the fact that the tender for last year was quite late at being issued and paving was actually taking place while snow was flying. Mr. Speaker, this year, for the 2012-2013, the government's 5-year highway improvement plan states that on Trunk 4, from 0.2 kilometres west of Campbell's Bridge, westerly to 0.2 kilometres west of McNabb's Bridge, 6.1 kilometres was to be completed. I'm wondering if the current Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal could advise us what is the status and whether that project has been completed.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend opposite for that question. And I'm very mindful of the member opposite's comments last time he raised this issue in the House, and he complained that the tendering was late, and as a result, the paving was late. This year, when we looked at that project, the initial estimates came in, and they were quite high. So we went back for the piece that he's talking about. So we went back and we had that looked at again in terms of redesign. That delayed the work going forward this year, but we wanted to do it right, and we wanted to do it on budget. So what we did is we did a redesign. That would have meant, if we had put the tenders out for it this year, that he would have had the same complaint again this year. He didn't want us paving late, so we've decided not to do that this year. We're going to pave that next year. We are going to pave that next year, and between now and then, the plan is to do the sort of preliminary work, the ditching and the culverts and that kind of work. But I can assure the member that the tender will go out this fall and early in the spring, so that it complies with his request. We're not paving late in the season. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, one thing I can say is that the former Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal never stood in his place as Minister to blame me or any members of the opposition for issues within his own department. Mr. Speaker, obviously this is a very important route between Richmond County and Cape Breton County, and one that we expect to see a tender come out. The tender is yet to be issued. We certainly hope to see...
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I'll now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I permit an introduction?
Most certainly.
Mr. Speaker, in the East Gallery is a friend of many in this House that they would know, and some other very fine people that I would like to introduce. The first person I'd like to introduce is the President of Nova Scotia, Music Nova Scotia, is Brian Doherty. A good friend of mine from Milwaukee, Mr. Speaker, the founder of Milwaukee Irish Fest, is Ed Ward. Patrick Boyle, who is the director of Milwaukee Irish Fest.